Welcome to Fiction Flux. Today, we're kicking off a brand new fanfiction adventure that's bound to keep you on the edge of your seat. Have you ever wondered what would happen if female Deku was the only hero in a world completely ruled by villains? Well, that's exactly what we're diving into today. No more wasting time, let's jump right into the action and see how this world unfolds. Get ready, because this one's going to be a wild ride. The world wasn't always this dark. There was a time when hope still flickered in the hearts of people, but even then, Izumi Midoriya could see the cracks forming. As a child, Izumi lived in a tiny apartment with her mother. It wasn't much, but it was home. Her mother, Inko, always tried her best to shield Izumi from the chaos outside. Yet, no amount of warm hugs or comforting words could hide the truth of the world they lived in. Villains were everywhere, growing bolder with each passing day. Heroes were dwindling, their numbers falling faster than anyone could replenish them. Izumi's earliest memory of why she wanted to be a hero was when she was 6. She and her mother were walking back from the market, their bags heavy with groceries. The street was eerily quiet, and Izumi clung to her mother's hand. "Mommy, why is it so quiet?" she asked, her small voice trembling. Before her mother could answer, a loud crash shattered the silence. A villain burst out of a nearby store, dragging a screaming woman with him. He had sharp, blade-like arms, and his laughter was cruel and piercing. Izumi froze. Her tiny legs refused to move as she stared at the scene. The woman was crying, begging for someone to help her, but the people around them either turned away or ran. "Mom, why isn't anyone helping?" Izumi whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Inko pulled Izumi close, her own face pale. "It's dangerous, Izumi. We can't do anything. Come on, let's go." But Izumi didn't want to leave. She wanted to run to the woman, to pull her away from the villain. She wanted to be strong enough to help. A hero finally arrived, a tired-looking man with a minor strength quirk. He managed to subdue the villain, but not before the woman was hurt. Izumi couldn't stop staring at the blood on the ground. That night, as Inko tucked her into bed, Izumi asked, "Mommy, why didn't more people help her?" Inko's face softened with sadness. "Sometimes, people are too scared, sweetheart. But that's why we have heroes." "But what if there aren't enough heroes?" Izumi pressed. Her mother smiled faintly, brushing a hand through Izumi's unruly green hair. "Then we need people who are brave enough to become them." Those words stayed with Izumi. As she grew older, the world only got worse. At 8, she saw a neighbor's store get ransacked by villains. The old man who owned it cried for help, but no heroes came. At 10, her best friend's family fled the city after their home was burned down in a villain attack. And at 12, Izumi watched a hero fall in battle, his blood staining the pavement. She wanted to help him, to save him, but all she could do was stand there, powerless. Every scene carved itself into her heart, each one a painful reminder of the world's cruelty. It was like a heavy chain wrapping around her, tightening with every tragedy she witnessed. But instead of breaking her, it hardened her resolve. At 14, Izumi sat in her room, flipping through her tattered notebook. It was filled with notes about heroes, strategies they used, their quirks, their weaknesses. She had pages dedicated to All Might, her idol, who still stood tall despite the growing tide of villainy. "I'll be a hero," she whispered to herself, gripping her pencil tightly. "No matter what it takes, I'll become strong enough to help people. Strong enough to make them feel safe again." But there was one glaring problem: she didn't have a quirk. At school, her classmates teased her relentlessly. "Quirkless Deku," they called her, laughing as they showed off their abilities. Even her childhood friend, Katsuki Bakugo, told her to give up on her dream. "Face it, Izumi," he said one day, his voice harsh and unforgiving. "You'll never be a hero. You're just a useless Deku in a world full of people stronger than you." His words cut deep, but they didn't extinguish the fire in her heart. If anything, they made it burn brighter. Then, everything changed one fateful evening. She was on her way home from school when she saw a boy no older than 8 cornered by a villain in a narrow alley. The villain's quirk was terrifying, a mass of writhing tentacles that lashed out at the boy, who was crying and screaming for help. Izumi's legs moved before her brain could catch up. "Hey!" she yelled, dropping her bag and running toward them. The villain turned, surprised to see a scrawny teenage girl charging at him with no hesitation. "What the hell do you think you're doing, kid?" he snarled. Izumi didn't stop. Her heart pounded in her chest as adrenaline took over. She grabbed a broken pipe lying on the ground and swung it with all her might. It wasn't enough to hurt the villain, but it distracted him long enough for the boy to run past her. "Go!" she screamed at the boy. "Run and find help." The villain growled, his tentacles slamming into her side and sending her crashing into the wall. Pain exploded through her body, but she didn't cry out. She pushed herself up, her legs shaking, and glared at the villain. "You think you're brave, huh?" he sneered. "Stupid kid. You'll die for nothing." Izumi wiped the blood from her lip, her eyes blazing with determination. "Maybe. But at least I'll die trying to do the right thing." Before the villain could strike again, a powerful gust of wind swept through the alley, slamming him into the ground. Izumi turned her head and saw him, All Might, standing tall and radiating strength. "Young lady," he said, his voice booming yet kind, "you were reckless, but incredibly brave." Izumi's legs gave out, and she collapsed to her knees. Tears streamed down her face, a mix of relief and exhaustion. I couldn't stand there and do nothing." All Might smiled at her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "The world needs people like you. People who don't give up, even when the odds are stacked against them." That moment solidified everything. Izumi would become a hero, quirk or no quirk. And when All Might passed the torch of one for all to her, it felt like destiny. Now, years later, Izumi stood as the last hero in a world of villains. The memories of her childhood, of the crying woman, the burning homes, and the fallen heroes, fueled her every step. She couldn't save everyone back then. But now, she would. Even if the world had given up, Izumi never would. She was a hero, not because of her quirk, but because of her unbreakable heart. Izumi Midoriya had learned the hard way that being a hero wasn't just about having a quirk or wearing a costume. It was about sacrifice, pain, and the unshakable will to keep standing no matter how many times the world knocked her down. As the years passed, the villains grew more powerful and organized. Cities fell one by one until only ruins remained. Heroes were hunted down mercilessly. Some gave up, some fled, and some were killed. All Might had been one of the last to fall, his light extinguished in a final, desperate battle to protect the people. Izumi had been there that day. She'd fought alongside him, her heart breaking as she watched her mentor push past his limits, his once mighty form faltering. As the villains overwhelmed him. "Don't cry, young Midoriya," All Might had said, his voice weak but steady. "The world still has you. You are the symbol now." She had screamed, tears streaming down her face, as he drew his last breath. And from that moment on, she vowed to carry his legacy, no matter how much it hurt. Now, at 21, Izumi stood alone against a world drowning in chaos. She moved from city to city, finding survivors, fighting back against villains, and trying to keep the fragile hope of humanity alive. Her body bore the scars of countless battles, but she didn't care. Every scar was a reminder of the lives she'd saved. One day, as Izumi walked through the crumbling remains of Musutafu, she stumbled across a group of children hiding in an abandoned building. They were thin, their faces pale and frightened. They flinched when they saw her, their small bodies trembling with fear. "It's okay," she said softly, kneeling to their level. "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm a hero." A boy no older than 10 stepped forward, his hands balled into fists. "Heroes don't exist anymore," he said, his voice shaky but defiant. "They all ran away, or died." Izumi's heart ached at his words, but she smiled gently. "I'm still here, and as long as I'm here, I'll protect you. I promise." The boy's eyes filled with tears, and he threw himself into her arms. The other children followed, clinging to her as if she were their last lifeline. That night, Izumi stayed with them, keeping watch as they slept. She told them stories of the old days, of All Might and the heroes who fought for peace. For the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years, hope. The next morning, Izumi led the children to a hidden shelter she had helped set up months ago. It was one of the few safe havens left, run by a small group of survivors who believed in her mission. "You're amazing, Izumi," one of the caretakers said as she handed her a canteen of water. "I don't know how you keep going." Izumi took a sip, her gaze distant. "Because if I stop, who will?" The caretaker nodded, her expression solemn. "You're the only hero left." Izumi's grip tightened on the canteen. Those words weighed heavily on her, but she couldn't let them crush her. She couldn't afford to falter. As she prepared to leave, one of the children ran up to her, a little girl with wide, curious eyes. "Miss Hero," she said, tugging on Izumi's sleeve. "Will you come back?" Izumi knelt down, ruffling the girl's hair. "Of course I will. Heroes always keep their promises." The girl smiled, and for a moment, the weight on Izumi's shoulders felt a little lighter. As she walked away from the shelter, Izumi glanced up at the gray, smoke-filled sky. The world was broken, but she would keep fighting. Not just for the children she'd saved, but for all the people still waiting for someone to stand up and say, "You're not alone." She tightened the straps on her battered gloves, the faint green glow of One for All sparking around her. "Let them come," she muttered under her breath, her eyes blazing with determination. "I'm not done yet." Izumi Midoriya was the last hero in a world of villains. And as long as she still drew breath, she would never stop fighting. Izumi moved through the streets like a ghost, her green lightning sparking faintly as she kept herself ready for any attack. She had learned long ago that the villains didn't sleep, they were always watching, always hunting. But that was fine. She was hunting, too. Her mind drifted as she stepped over rubble and broken glass. Memories of her childhood flashed before her, the times when heroes were still symbols of hope, when kids still dreamed of growing up to be like All Might, and when her biggest worry was finishing a school assignment. It felt like a lifetime ago. She remembered her mom's gentle hands brushing through her hair, telling her everything would be okay. Izumi hadn't heard her mother's voice in years. She had disappeared during one of the early attacks on Musudafu. Izumi had searched for her, fought tooth and nail to find her, but the world didn't give her the luxury of happy endings. Sometimes, on quiet nights, Izumi would sit alone and imagine what her mom would say if she saw her now. Would she be proud of her? Or would she beg her to stop, to let someone else carry the burden? The thoughts haunted her, but they also fueled her. Every fight, every life she saved, was for the people she'd lost. As Izumi turned a corner, she heard voices ahead, gruff and mocking. She crouched low, peering around the edge of a crumbling building. A group of villains stood near the remains of a grocery store, harassing a young man who looked terrified. "Come on, kid," one of the villains sneered, his quirk creating small explosions in his hands. "Hand over what you've got, and maybe we won't kill you." The young man shook his head, clutching a bag of supplies. "This is for my family," he stammered. "Please, don't." Before he could finish, the villain raised his hand, ready to strike. "Hey!" Izumi's voice cut through the air like a blade. The villains turned to see her standing there, her tattered green hero suit clinging to her bruised body. Her emerald eyes burned with fury. "Connected with the oh, great," one of them groaned. "It's her. You mean the wannabe hero who doesn't know when to quit?" Another laughed. Izumi ignored their taunts. She stepped forward, her fists crackling with green energy. "You have two choices," she said coldly. "Walk away, or I'll make you." The leader of the group, a man with jagged scars across his face, sneered. "You think you scare us? You're just one girl. You can't take us all." Izumi didn't respond. She didn't need to. She launched herself forward, her body moving faster than they could react. Her fist connected with the leader's jaw, sending him flying into a pile of rubble. The others scrambled to attack, their quirks flaring. One sent a wave of fire at her, but Izumi flipped over it, landing gracefully behind him. She grabbed his arm and twisted, dislocating it before throwing him into his companion. The fight was brutal. Every punch, every kick, sent pain shooting through her body, but she didn't let it stop her. She couldn't. These villains were just another obstacle in her path. When the dust settled, the villains lay unconscious around her. Izumi stood in the middle of the chaos, her chest heaving. Blood dripped from her knuckles, but she didn't care. The young man she'd saved stared at her in awe. Why, you're amazing, he said, his voice trembling. Izumi turned to him, her expression softening. Are you hurt? He shook his head, clutching his bag tighter. No, thank you. I don't know how to repay you. You don't have to, Izumi said, her voice gentle. Just take care of your family. That's all the thanks I need. As the man hurried off, Izumi watched him go, a small smile tugging at her lips. Moments like this reminded her why she kept fighting. Even if the world had fallen apart, there were still people worth saving. But her smile faded as she turned her gaze to the horizon. The villains weren't the only problem. Somewhere out there, a shadow loomed, a force greater than any single villain. The one who had orchestrated this downfall. She didn't know his name, but she knew his power. He was the one who had united the villains, who had turned the tide against the heroes. And Izumi knew that eventually, she would have to face him. She tightened her gloves, the faint glow of 1-4, all sparking around her once more. I'm coming for you, she muttered under her breath. And with that, she disappeared into the shadows, ready for the battles ahead. The air grew colder as Izumi pressed onward, the faint hum of One for All, her constant companion in the silence. She knew the world she had stepped into was a wasteland not just of cities but of hope. Villains ruled the remnants of society, divided into factions under the command of a single figure, a man cloaked in mystery and terror. The Villain King. No one knew his real name. Some said he was a ghost from the Age of Heroes, others whispered that he was a creation of pure malice born from the chaos. What Izumi knew for certain was that he was the mastermind behind the fall of hero society. He had organized the villains, crushed any opposition, and extinguished the last sparks of hope. But she wasn't afraid of him. Her path took her to the outskirts of the city, where the ruins of an old hero training facility stood. This was where she had trained under All Might, where she had first learned to wield One for All. Now, it was a graveyard of memories, littered with broken statues and shattered glass. Izumi stopped in front of a scorched plaque, brushing the dirt off with her gloved hand. The words engraved on it were faded, but she didn't need to read them to remember, for justice and peace. Her jaw tightened. Justice and peace seemed like distant dreams now, but they weren't impossible. She knelt and closed her eyes, taking a moment to gather her thoughts. All Might, she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. If you're watching, I hope I'm making you proud. I hope I'm strong enough. The wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of ash and earth. Izumi stood and turned toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, the Villain King was waiting. She could feel it. She wasn't going to run from him. She wasn't going to wait for him to make the first move. If she wanted to end this, if she wanted to save what was left of the world, she had to face him head-on. The next few days were grueling. Izumi traveled through treacherous terrain, facing waves of villains who had heard rumors of her presence. Each battle left her more battered than the last, but she refused to stop. Her body ached, her breaths came in ragged gasps, but her determination was unshaken. Finally, she reached the heart of the Villain King's domain, a towering fortress built from the remains of cities he had conquered. It loomed over the wasteland like a dark monument to his power. Izumi stood at the gates, her fists clenched. The fortress seemed to pulse with an ominous energy, as if it were alive. So, you finally made it. The voice was deep and chilling, sending a shiver down Izumi's spine. She turned to see him standing atop the fortress walls, a figure clad in black, his face obscured by a mask. The Villain King. I've been watching you, Midoriya Izumi, he said, his tone mocking. The last hero in a world of villains. Do you really think you can stop me? Izumi stepped forward, her green lightning crackling around her. I don't think. I know. You've taken enough from this world. I'm here to make sure you don't take any more. The Villain King laughed, a sound that echoed across the barren landscape. Brave words. But bravery alone won't save you. You're alone, Midoriya. You have no allies, no backup. What can one girl do against the weight of the world? Izumi's eyes narrowed, her voice steady. I may be alone, but I carry the will of everyone who fought before me. I carry their dreams, their hopes, and their sacrifices. That's more powerful than anything you'll ever understand. The Villain King raised a hand, and shadows began to swirl around him, forming monstrous shapes that growled and snapped at the air. Then let's see if your resolve is enough to withstand me. Izumi didn't flinch. She surged forward, her body glowing with the full power of One for All. The ground cracked beneath her feet as she launched herself into the air, her fist aimed directly at the villain king. The battle that followed was like nothing Izumi had ever faced. The villain king's power was overwhelming, his attacks relentless and devastating. Every strike he delivered felt like a hammer blow, and every counterattack she made seemed to barely scratch him. But she didn't give up. Her body screamed in protest, her vision blurred, but she pushed herself beyond her limits. She thought of her mother, of All Might, of every person who had believed in her. She thought of the children she had saved, the survivors who still looked to her as a symbol of hope. I won't let you win. She screamed, her voice raw with emotion. This world isn't yours to take. With a final surge of power, Izumi unleashed everything she had. Her body burned with the energy of One for All, and her fist connected with the villain king's chest. The impact created a shockwave that shattered the ground and sent him flying. As the dust settled, Izumi collapsed to her knees, her body trembling from exhaustion. The villain king lay motionless a few feet away, his mask cracked and his aura diminished. She had won, but as Izumi looked around at the destruction, she knew her fight wasn't over. The world was still broken, and there was still so much to rebuild. With a deep breath, she pushed herself to her feet. She wasn't just the last hero in a world of villains, she was the first step toward a new beginning. And she wouldn't stop until hope was restored. Izumi staggered to her feet, her breaths ragged and uneven. Her entire body felt like it was on fire, every nerve screaming in protest. Blood dripped from a deep cut on her forehead, blurring her vision as it trickled into her eyes. But she didn't care. She couldn't afford to stop now. The villain king lay crumpled on the ground, motionless. His mask, now split down the middle, revealed a face that shocked Izumi. He wasn't a monster or some mythical being, as she had imagined. He was just a man, tired, scarred, and broken. His face bore deep lines of pain and anger, the remnants of a life filled with suffering. Why? She asked, her voice hoarse as she stepped closer. Why did you do all of this? Why destroy everything? You could have used your power to build something better. The man chuckled weakly, his voice a rasp. You're so naive, he said, coughing up blood. There's no such thing as a better world. People don't change. They destroy, they betray, they hurt. I just gave them the freedom to show their true selves. Izumi shook her head, her fists trembling. You're wrong. People can change. I've seen it. I've lived it. The world you created might be filled with darkness, but there's still light. There's still hope. And as long as I'm alive, I'll fight to prove that to you. The villain king's eyes softened for a brief moment, as if her words had reached something buried deep within him. But then his gaze hardened again. You're a fool, Midoriya. You'll die chasing that dream, just like all the others. Maybe, Izumi admitted, her voice steady. But I'd rather die fighting for hope than live in a world without it. The man's head fell back, his body going still. Izumi waited, her guard still up, but there was no movement. His reign was over, but the battle had taken its toll. Her legs gave out, and she collapsed to her knees, staring up at the darkened sky. She felt the weight of the world pressing down on her, heavier than ever. She had won, but at what cost? The cities were still in ruins, the people scattered and afraid. This wasn't the end, it was just the beginning of an even harder fight. After a few moments, she forced herself to her feet. The world wasn't going to fix itself, and she wasn't about to wait for someone else to step up. She was still the last hero, and she had a promise to keep. She walked back through the wasteland, her steps slow but deliberate. Along the way, she passed the remnants of the battles she had fought, the ruins of buildings, the shattered streets, and the memories of those she couldn't save. Eventually, she returned to the shelter where the children she had saved were waiting. As she approached, the little girl from before ran out to meet her, her eyes wide with relief. You came back, the girl cried, throwing her arms around Izumi. Izumi knelt down, hugging the child tightly despite the pain it caused her battered body. I told you I'd keep my promise. The other children and caretakers gathered around her, their faces a mixture of awe and gratitude. For the first time in a long while, Izumi felt a flicker of warmth in her chest. "You're hurt," one of the caretakers said, reaching for her arm. "I'm fine," Izumi replied, waving them off. "There's still so much to do. We need to rebuild, to find the others. We can't let this be the end." The caretaker nodded, tears in her eyes. "You're incredible, Izumi. You've given us hope again." Izumi looked at the small group of survivors, her heart swelling with determination. "It's not just me," she said. "We're going to do this together. The world might be broken, but we're still here. And as long as we keep moving forward, we can make it better." The children cheered, their voices filling the air with a sound Izumi hadn't heard in years, laughter. It was small and fragile, but it was a start. As the sun began to rise over the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and gold, Izumi stood tall, her silhouette framed by the light. The fight wasn't over. The journey was just beginning. But for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Hope. The days following the villain king's fall were both exhausting and inspiring. Word spread quickly that he had been defeated, though no one knew who had done it. Izumi preferred it that way. She wasn't looking for fame or recognition, she just wanted the world to heal. The shelter became a hub for survivors. Families who had been in hiding began to emerge, tentatively making their way to safety. Izumi worked tirelessly to help them, using what little resources she had to repair the shelter, distribute supplies, and even teach the children basic self-defense. But the world outside was still dangerous. With the villain king gone, smaller factions of villains began to fight for dominance, trying to fill the void of power he left behind. Izumi knew she couldn't stay in one place for long, there were too many people still out there who needed help. One night, as she sat by a small fire in the shelter's courtyard, the caretaker approached her with a cup of warm tea. "You've been pushing yourself too hard," the caretaker said, sitting down beside her. "You need rest, Izumi. Even heroes aren't invincible." Izumi took the tea, staring into its swirling surface. "I know," she admitted. "But I can't stop. Not yet. There's so much to fix, and every day we wait, more people suffer." The caretaker placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You've already done so much. You gave us hope when we had none. But rebuilding the world isn't something you can do alone." Izumi's grip on the cup tightened. She thought about the children who smiled at her every day, the families who thanked her with tears in their eyes. She thought about her mother, All Might, and all the people she'd lost along the way. "I can't let anyone else go through what I did," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If I have the power to help, then I have to use it." The caretaker didn't press her further. She simply nodded, her expression filled with understanding. The next morning, Izumi prepared to leave again. The children clung to her legs, begging her to stay, but she knelt down and smiled at them. "I'll come back," she promised. "And when I do, I'll bring more people with me. We're going to make this world safe again. Together." With those words, she set off once more, her heart heavy but determined. As Izumi traveled through the desolate landscape, she began to encounter small pockets of resistance, groups of survivors who had banded together to fight back against the villains. They were untrained and under-equipped, but they had something that couldn't be extinguished: hope. She joined forces with them, teaching them what she could and helping them defend their homes. Slowly but surely, she began to see change. Villains were pushed back, communities were rebuilt, and people began to believe in heroes again. One day, while scouting an abandoned city, Izumi stumbled across something she hadn't seen in years: a tattered hero's uniform hanging in the window of a ruined shop. It belonged to Endeavor, the former #2 hero. She stared at it for a long time, her mind racing. If there were still remnants of the old heroes, perhaps there were still heroes out there who had survived. The thought filled her with renewed determination. She wasn't just fighting to save the people who had survived, she was fighting to bring back what the world had lost. Months turned into years. Izumi became a legend, her name whispered among survivors and villains alike. Some called her the Green Flame, a beacon of hope in a world of darkness. Others called her a ghost, a phantom who appeared only when she was needed most. But Izumi didn't care about the names or the stories. She cared about the people she saved, the lives she touched, and the future she was building. And one day, as she stood on the edge of a cliff overlooking a rebuilt village, she felt a presence behind her. "You've done well, Midoriya." She turned, her eyes widening as she saw a familiar face. It was Shoto Todoroki, older and battle-worn, but very much alive. Beside him stood several other heroes she had thought were long gone. "We heard about what you've been doing," Shoto said, his voice filled with admiration. "You kept the fire alive when the rest of us couldn't. We're here to help." Izumi's heart swelled as she looked at the group before her. She wasn't alone anymore. Together, they would rebuild the world, one step at a time. And this time, she knew they would succeed. Izumi stood in silence for a moment, her mind racing as she processed the sight before her. Shoto Todoroki, several other former heroes. The faces she thought she'd never see again were here, alive, and standing beside her. I can't believe it," Izumi said, her voice shaky with emotion. "I thought I was the only one left. I thought the world had lost all its heroes." Shoto stepped forward, his expression calm but filled with a quiet strength. "We were scattered, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the right time. The villain king's fall was the spark we needed. You kept the flame burning all this time, Izumi." Izumi's eyes welled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. "I couldn't have done it without people like you, without those who still believed in a better future." The others nodded, stepping forward to join Shoto. There was the stoic and battle-worn Kirishima, a woman whose name Izumi didn't know, and several other familiar faces from the past. Together, they made a formidable team. They weren't the same heroes they had once been, but they were something new, something stronger, forged in the fires of a broken world. "We've seen what you've done, Izumi," Kirishima said, a smile tugging at his lips. "You've given people hope again. Now it's time for us to help you finish what you started." Izumi felt a rush of gratitude and relief flood through her. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she wasn't carrying the world on her shoulders alone. There was still a long road ahead, but with her old comrades by her side, the weight felt just a little lighter. "We'll need to rebuild everything," Izumi said, her voice more resolute now. "The cities, the education system, the hero organizations. The world has been broken for so long. It's going to take more than just a few battles to fix it." Shoto nodded. "We're prepared. But it's not just about fighting anymore. We need to unite people, villains, survivors, even those who've been lost in the chaos. We need to show them that they can still change, just like you showed me." Izumi's heart warmed at the mention of the last battle with the villain king, where she had been forced to confront not just her enemy, but herself. That moment had changed everything for her, reminding her that her fight wasn't only for survival, it was for the future, for a world where people didn't have to live in fear anymore. "We'll bring them together," she said, looking at each of her allies, her voice filled with certainty. "We'll show them that heroes still exist, and that they're worth fighting for." The days that followed were filled with action. Izumi and her new team worked tirelessly to rebuild the infrastructure of society. They helped small communities rebuild their homes, taught new generations the value of compassion, justice, and the power of change. The world slowly began to heal, piece by piece. But there were still challenges ahead. As Izumi had feared, the villains who had once been under the villain king's rule weren't simply going to disappear. Some tried to fill the power vacuum, creating chaos and terror in the already fragile world. Others, however, realized the error of their ways. With guidance and support from the heroes, they were given a chance to change. Izumi stood before a group of former villains, who had now turned their backs on their old ways. They were bruised, battered, and broken, but the one thing they shared with the survivors was the undeniable spark of hope. "You've made the choice to change," Izumi said, her voice firm. "It's not going to be easy. But I promise you, there's a place for you in this world. All you have to do is keep moving forward." She extended her hand toward them, a gesture of trust. One by one, they accepted it, joining her and her team in the fight for a better future. Years passed, and the world began to resemble something far more familiar. The cities began to rise from the ashes, the scars of the past slowly fading into the distance. People laughed, played, and dreamed again. Izumi stood on the balcony of a rebuilt skyscraper, overlooking the city below. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over everything. She could hear the laughter of children in the streets, the sounds of construction as the city continued to rebuild. Behind her, Shoto approached, his hands in his pockets. "We did it, Izumi," he said quietly. "The world is finally starting to heal." Izumi smiled, a soft but contented expression that spoke volumes. "Yeah, we did. But we still have a long way to go." "We'll get there," Shoto said, nodding. Together, Izumi glanced at the horizon, feeling a sense of peace settle in her heart. She had fought for so long, for so many. And now, as she stood alongside those she once admired, she knew that the fight was far from over. But it wasn't just her fight anymore. It was the fight of everyone who believed in a better future, a future where heroes weren't just those who fought in the shadows but those who stood together in the light. And with that, Izumi Midoriya, the last hero in a world of villains, smiled, knowing she had found her place in a world that would rise again. Izumi stood at the edge of the balcony, the wind gently tugging at her hair, her eyes scanning the horizon. The world was changing, and she had been a part of it. It was hard to believe that only a few years ago, everything had seemed hopeless. Now, there was life, there was laughter, and there was hope. But even with everything she had accomplished, Izumi couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Deep down, a knot of unease coiled in her chest, a warning she couldn't quite place. Suddenly, a voice broke through her thoughts. "Izumi." Shoto's voice was laced with a note of concern. Izumi turned to face him, her heart thumping in her chest. He had a strange look in his eyes. "What's wrong?" she asked, her tone sharp as her instincts kicked in. Shoto stepped closer, his hand clenching into a fist. "I don't know how to say this, but we've been hearing rumors. There's something happening in the shadows. Something bigger than we thought." Izumi's heart skipped a beat. What kind of rumors? Another villain. One who's been gathering followers in secret. "We've tracked them down, but there's no telling what they're planning. Some of the survivors are even saying they're connected to the villain king, but that can't be possible, right?" Izumi's mind raced as the pieces began to fall into place. She had known this peace couldn't last. There had to be something lurking beneath the surface. Something she hadn't anticipated. "I thought we ended this," she whispered. Shoto's face grew darker, and he nodded grimly. "So did I. But it seems like the fight isn't over. Not by a long shot." Izumi felt a cold shiver run down her spine. There was a new darkness on the horizon, and this time, she didn't know if she was ready. The future they had worked so hard for, the future they had fought for, might be slipping through their fingers before they even had a chance to fully grasp it. A sudden roar echoed through the city, breaking the silence. A shockwave rattled the glass windows of the building, and the ground beneath them trembled. Izumi's blood ran cold. She didn't need to see the destruction to know what had just happened. This was only the beginning of something far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. "No, it can't be," she muttered, her hands trembling. Shoto grabbed her arm, his grip firm. "We need to go, now." Izumi didn't need any further encouragement. Without another word, they turned and rushed out of the building, their minds focused on the looming threat. As they made their way through the city, the rumble of distant explosions grew louder. The sound of chaos and destruction filled the air. Izumi felt it in her bones. This wasn't just some random attack. It was something far more coordinated, far more terrifying. And just as they reached the edge of the city, a shadow fell across them. A figure stood in the distance, their silhouette massive and imposing. Izumi's heart raced as the figure stepped forward, and she could feel the raw power radiating from them. This wasn't just some villain, they were something entirely different. Something far more dangerous. Izumi's voice trembled as she spoke. "What is this?" But before she could even finish her sentence, the figure's laughter echoed through the city, a sound that sent chills down her spine. It was the laughter of someone who had been waiting for this moment. Waiting for them to let their guard down. "Is this the best the heroes can do?" The figure's voice boomed. "How quaint. Let's see how you handle me." And with that, the figure raised a hand, and the sky seemed to crack with a violent force. Izumi's breath caught in her throat. The future she had been fighting for was now hanging in the balance, and the world she had worked so hard to rebuild was on the verge of crumbling. But the worst part was this: she didn't know if she could win this time. She didn't know if there was enough of her left to stop this new threat. As the world seemed to shatter around her, Izumi turned to Shoto, her eyes full of doubt and fear. But there was something else in them, too, something that could never be extinguished. The same resolve that had kept her going all these years. "We have to stop this," she said, her voice fierce despite the uncertainty. Shoto nodded. Together. But as the shadow of the new villain loomed larger, they both knew one thing for certain: this was only the beginning of a new fight, one that would challenge everything they had ever known. And with that, this story ends, for now. I hope you enjoyed reading this first part of the fanfiction. Let me know your thoughts in the comments box. Should I continue this series, or do you think it's time for a new story? I would love to hear your opinions. Until we meet again, have a great time, and remember, heroes never truly disappear.